Most people assume primitive traps were cruel, indiscriminate tools, desperate measures from a harsher age. The common image is a jagged pit concealed with leaves or a brutal deadfall crushing anything unlucky enough to pass. But when you look closely at the historical record, a different reality emerges. Many traditional trapping systems were carefully engineered to conserve energy, minimize suffering, and protect the surrounding ecosystem. In some cases, they were more selective and more humane than poorly placed modern firearms. The real story is not about brutality. It is about restraint, knowledge of animal behavior, and survival under constraint. Long before industrial food systems, communities survived because they understood the movement patterns, seasonal rhythms, and physical limits of the animals around them. Primitive traps were not random devices, they were expressions of ecological literacy, and for modern foragers, especially those thinking seriously about long-term resilience, there are lessons here that go far beyond nostalgia. Understanding that trapping was once a matter of energy economics, not sport, changes how we see it. In pre-industrial societies, hunting was governed by a simple equation: calories spent versus calories gained. A hunter who burned more energy than he brought home endangered not only himself but his family or tribe. Primitive traps emerged as a solution to this equation. Once constructed and properly placed, they work continuously without constant human presence. In northern Eurasia, for example, indigenous Siberian communities developed intricate deadfall systems for sable and marten along known travel corridors. These were not scattered randomly through forests. They were placed along fallen logs, ridge lines, and natural bottlenecks where animals already moved. The design ensured that only animals of a certain size triggered the mechanism, sparing smaller non-target species. The trapper's skill lay not in brute force but in observation. In North America, Paiute and other Great Basin peoples used funnel-shaped rock alignments to guide small game toward snares. These were cooperative constructions, sometimes maintained for generations. The objective was predictable yield with minimal disruption. When compared to the waste that sometimes accompanied 19th-century commercial market hunting with firearms, these systems appear almost conservative. The misconception that primitive traps were indiscriminate often reflects later misuse, not original intent. As fur markets expanded in the 17th through 19th centuries, traditional trapping knowledge was absorbed into global trade networks. Demand escalated, efficiency became profit. In that context, restraint eroded. Steel leg-hold traps replaced wooden deadfalls in many regions because they could be mass-produced and deployed in higher volume. Earlier indigenous and subsistence-focused systems were often regulated by custom. Certain trap lines were seasonal, and certain breeding periods were totally off-limits. If someone violated these norms, they risked social sanction because, overharvesting threatened the survival of the whole community. The technology itself was just one part of the picture. The ethics that governed its use were equally important. This distinction really matters today. When people critique so-called primitive methods as inherently cruel, they often end up confusing subsistence-era designs with industrial-scale exploitation. Historically, many traps were actually engineered to dispatch quickly, or to hold animals with minimal injury until the trapper returned, precisely because damaged pelts lost value and, honestly, suffering was culturally discouraged. The deadfall, which is often dismissed as crude, was actually frequently a study in mechanical precision. The Paiute deadfall, commonly called the figure 4 trap, really demonstrates how simple materials can produce reliable and relatively humane outcomes. When it's properly constructed, the weight falls cleanly, targeting the neck or upper body of small mammals. It actually requires careful carving and balance. A poorly set trap just fails. but a well-set trap works instantly. In medieval Europe, variations of deadfall and box traps were used for rabbits and small predators around agricultural settlements. Written records from estate management manuals describe positioning traps along hedgerows and warren entrances, emphasizing maintenance and inspection to prevent unnecessary suffering. Even in feudal systems, trapping was integrated into broader land stewardship practices. For the modern forager, the lesson is not romanticism, it is that effectiveness depends on craftsmanship and knowledge. A poorly understood tool becomes unethical quickly. Snares reveal how behavioral insight mattered more than hardware. So, a snare is often imagined as a cruel wire loop, but historically, materials varied quite a bit. People used plant fibers, sinew, even horsehair. Placement was everything, honestly. Trappers would study habitual paths, what biologists today call game trails. The loop was set at a height specific to the target species. The goal really was a quick cervical catch or rapid tightening. In Arctic regions, Inuit hunters used carefully measured snares for Arctic fox, setting them near den entrances during specific seasons. Overuse would collapse local populations, so rotation and restraint were just part of the practice. Survival in such harsh climates just didn't allow for reckless depletion. Modern survival manuals sometimes present snares as a last-ditch tactic, and honestly, they often leave out important context. Historically, snares were part of managed systems. The difference is knowledge density. Without understanding animal movement, breeding cycles, and terrain, even a simple snare becomes indiscriminate. Large-scale communal traps show how societies balanced efficiency with sustainability. Across parts of sub-Saharan Africa and pre-contact North America, communal drives directed animals toward corrals or drop-offs. These methods required coordination and were often seasonal. Contrary to the perception of mass slaughter, many of these hunts were tied to migratory cycles and followed by periods of non-harvest. Archaeological evidence from bison jump sites in the Great Plains shows organized processing and preservation. The scale appears dramatic, but the events were episodic, aligned with herd movements. Entire communities mobilized to maximize yield when opportunity presented itself, then relied on stored provisions. The key point is strategic timing. Primitive trapping and hunting systems were frequently embedded in ecological calendars. For modern preparedness thinking, this suggests that sustainability is less about the tool and more about when and how it is used. Military history quietly reinforced the importance of low-visibility food procurement. During 20th century conflicts, particularly in resistance movements and remote campaigns, small unit survival sometimes depended on trapping rather than gunfire. Firearms reveal position, ammunition runs out, noise travels. Accounts from Eastern Front partisans in World War II describe improvised snares and deadfalls set near forest encampments. The objective was caloric supplementation without compromising concealment. Similarly, some Pacific Theater units learned local trapping methods from Indigenous guides to supplement limited rations. These were not romantic bushcraft exercises. They were pragmatic responses to supply chain failure. After the war, survival training in several militaries incorporated quiet procurement techniques, acknowledging that technology does not eliminate vulnerability. For preparedness-minded viewers today, this history underscores a practical truth. Redundancy matters. Systems fail, noise attracts attention, low-tech knowledge remains relevant precisely because it does not depend on fragile infrastructure. Ethics were often enforced by necessity rather than written law. In subsistence contexts, waste was self-punishing. An animal taken and not fully used represented lost labor and future scarcity. Many traditional societies embedded ritual acknowledgement of the animal's life into the hunt, not as superstition but as reinforcement of restraint. Even in early modern Europe, poaching laws, however unevenly applied, reflected recognition that wildlife depletion had social consequences. By the late 19th century, conservation movements emerged in response to visible collapse of species, such as the American bison. Ironically, industrial-scale hunting with advanced weapons caused more rapid devastation than centuries of lower-tech methods. This historical arc challenges the assumption that modernity automatically equates to ethical improvement. Ethics depend on incentives and limits. When profit eclipses subsistence, restraint weakens. Foragers today operate within legal frameworks and ecological pressures very different from those of the past. Modern wildlife management laws exist precisely because past overharvesting revealed the fragility of ecosystems. Any discussion of primitive trapping must acknowledge contemporary regulations and conservation science. What was sustainable at low population densities may not be sustainable in heavily developed landscapes, yet the underlying principles, selectivity, minimal suffering, seasonal awareness, and respect for carrying capacity, remain valid. If anything, they are more necessary now. Ethical modern foraging requires integration of traditional knowledge with current ecological data. The most important lesson is not how to build a trap. It is, honestly, how to think. Primitive trapping systems were intellectual achievements shaped by constraint. They required reading terrain, understanding animal psychology, conserving energy, and respecting limits. They reveal that survival is not a matter of aggression, but of calibration. When modern audiences dismiss these methods as relics of brutality, they overlook the sophistication embedded within them. When enthusiasts romanticize them without context, they risk repeating historical mistakes of overuse. The deeper story is about balance. Technology changes, human incentives fluctuate, but the relationship between effort, restraint, and sustainability remains constant. Remembering these forgotten methods is not about turning back the clock. It is about recovering insight. In an era where supply chains stretch across continents and food appears detached from landscape, understanding how previous generations sustained themselves under pressure sharpens perspective. It reminds us that resilience is built from knowledge, discipline, and limits willingly observed. If you value this kind of careful historical analysis, stories that go beyond surface narratives and recover what was quietly essential, subscribe to the Prepper Historian and share this video. The overlooked lessons are often the ones that matter most.